Uh, all right, let's go ahead and get started. Um, Hi, everybody. My name's Ali. I'm the director for the Center for Applied Data Ethics at the University of San Francisco. Today, I'm really excited to introduce a speaker, somebody that I've known for a while and whose work I've really admired for just years now. Cennydd Bowles is a designer and futurist with several decades of experience advising all sorts of companies, including Twitter, Accenture, Samsung, even the BBC. He wrote this book called Future Ethics, which I think I devoured in the span of like a day. It was a really great read that I totally encourage anybody who hasn't read it to go get. And he currently runs the Responsible Design and Future Studio Now Next. So I'm so excited to have him here to talk about the work that he's been thinking about lately. And so with that, I'll sort of cede the floor to Cennydd Bowles.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Great to be here. Thank you for this opportunity to speak with you today. Pretty obviously, we've seen a revolution in technology ethics in the last few years, and it's a field that I've now been part of for coming up 5 years, something like that. So today, I'm kind of here to give you a bit of a perspective from what I'm seeing on the ground. Now, I'm not an academic. You can tell that by the way the way you know this is because my talk title doesn't have like a colon and then a subtitle. It's just one thing. So I want to give you a perspective from the ground on what I'm seeing happening right now within the industry, the trends and the tensions, but then focusing more on this piece about responses. What can we actually start to do? What can we hope for within the field that's a promising avenue for development, if you like. Now, I'm a designer by background, so I'm going to be speaking perhaps more from a design perspective. Hopefully, you'll find that interesting. If you're not a designer, it will still be a chance to sort of see what things look like from a neighboring hill, if you like. Now, I see everything really that's happening right now, this rush of activity in tech ethics, really is a result of three forces, almost like tectonic plates coming together at a fault line, right? There's this tension and it's caused this eruption of interest. And these plates, for me, are customer, regulatory, and employee pressure. And for all the scandals that we've had in the tech industry over the last few years, for all of that changing narrative about tech, I think within the industry, there was still a lot of people who were optimistic, who were bullish, saying, there's not really any evidence that this is actually changing public attitudes to tech. And actually, for a long time, that did seem to be the case. But now we are getting the evidence that the trend is increasingly clear that the public is losing confidence in the technology sector. Certainly, confidence is at its lowest point in a decade. Pretty much that's the data that we have available. What you see here is data from Pew Research and from Edelman's Trust Barometer. And what you'll notice here is that sentiment actually used to be very positive. There's a very high starting point for this. Positive view of the tech industry going back over the last decade. It was a very trusted sector. But it's clear that trust has cratered in the last few years. And Edelman on the right here, they found this has happened across all major subsectors of technology as well, across AI, across telecoms, across virtual reality, and so on. And we've now reached the point where only 19% of the British public think that tech companies design with their best interests in mind, which is kind of a horrifying figure, right? That's a fairly damning indictment of the ethical problems that the sector has faced. Now, if you drill into that dissatisfaction, finding out what's behind those concerns, a fairly common theme is that people think that technology has had a negative effect on society at large. Now, this is a little graph from Everyone, a think tank based in the UK that folded sort of middle of last year. But they conducted an attitude survey of the British public, and they found that generally people think the internet has been good for them individually, but that picture is much murkier when it comes to the impact on society overall. And so we're seeing now this sort of public disquiet creeping into media, for example, into Netflix shows. The Social Dilemma, for example, is one. You may perhaps have come across this. It's an expose featuring Tristan Harris and other very contrite Silicon Valley types. It's fair to say it's not got a great reputation, I think, within the tech ethics field, but it's bringing this message, at least to a wider audience. We have coded bias, which is a very recent expose on racist facial recognition technology inspired by Joy Bolamwini's work. And then we have, of course, Black Mirror, which is really a kind of neo-Aesop's fable collection, right? It's telling the story of a techno dystopia that lurks around the corner. Now, there's some reinforcement here, I think. These films and these programs, they reflect our current concerns, but of course, they also add to them. They heighten the belief that tech is harmful, that tech is out to get us. And meanwhile, the press has become very adept at spotting and exploiting the missteps of the industry. They're starting to realize what angles will grab attention, what will make for good stories. They're starting to know which critical voices they should listen to as well. And they have increasingly very good sources. They have, Signal contact lists full of disgruntled employees who are now willing to leak information as a last resort. And so it's fairly clear we have this kind of growing resentment or disappointment about the sector. But interestingly, there seems still to be a bit of a gap between public belief and public behavior. People are reporting that they like the industry less and less, but they're still buying technology. The industry is still flourishing. Tech stocks went up enormously during COVID. The public clearly finds technology useful and beneficial. It's almost like they like that technology despite the best efforts of the tech sector. They're sort of resigned to feeling disempowered, to be disappointed and abused by their technologies. And this is a profound missed opportunity, I think, because there's plenty of evidence now that consumers are increasingly driven by values. They want their companies to behave more responsibly, more ethically. Salesforce have conducted some research into this. They found that 93% of the US public feel that companies have to look beyond profit to positively impact society. 86% will be more loyal to a company that demonstrates good ethics. Now, this is a significant shift from the old Milton Friedman doctrine that profit has to triumph above everything else. We even have the Financial Times and the Economist saying that a change needs to occur. We need to usher in an era of responsible capitalism, which is surprising because these are, the FT and the Economist are generally paragons of business interests. So if they're calling for a reset, this new era of responsible stakeholder capitalism, clearly something is changing here. Regulatory pressure is also building quite obviously as well now, and that will continue apace for several years still. When it comes to technology, to be honest, democracies still really haven't regulated a thing. The only territories that have regulated strongly are the authoritarian regimes, for example, China. The rest of the world has generally left technology to self-regulate as an industry. Now, we've seen some change in this. We've seen in the last few years a lot of activity, obviously, in privacy regulation. In the EU, we've had the GDPR, data protection regulations. Not perfect by any means, but they've given teeth to data protection offices that previously there haven't been any. British Airways, for example, got fined $183 million for a significant data breach, and that was reduced on appeal. But still, the previous Data Protection Act would have only allowed a maximum fine of $250,000. And now this is not just the EU. We're also seeing other regions starting to become involved. India, Brazil, possibly even we might see a US federal privacy regulation in this under this presidency. I'm not entirely sure. But we're also seeing more local enforcement as well, more city DAs and local law enforcement starting to take action in the absence of that kind of federal pressure. And clearly this sort of regulatory pressure is going to expand beyond privacy as well. Facial recognition, there's a number of challenges and bans already on police and public use, plenty more to come. AI decisions, GDPR for the EU gave some light requirements, but then just a couple of weeks ago, the EU has published essentially a new sort of draft bill on regulating AI that will say there are certain high-risk cases that simply will not be permitted, including surveillance and manipulation and so on. It's possible that the EU may go further and say they might mandate that AI decisions above a certain threshold of notability will have to be explainable. In California, for example, it's already unlawful to use a bot for commerce or for political influence unless you disclose that it's a bot. We also know things like elections are vulnerable to interference, so we'll probably see laws on provenance and synthetic content, deep fakes, things like that, and dark patterns. Again, a growing interest in dark patterns, manipulative interfaces. The FTC just held a large symposium about it last week. The FEC in the US has just said they intend to ban dark patterns for political purposes after essentially the Trump campaign hoodwinked a lot of people into donating weekly rather than as a one-off. And so there are already kind of a few bills in progress around the place across Europe and the US around dark patterns. Now, some cynics will say this is actually the point of the tech ethics movement, that companies are engaging with this space essentially so they can avoid future regulation. Now, from my point of view, I'm quite happy to say that I haven't seen that to be the case, certainly not as an explicit motivation. I've not walked into a company and heard that raised as a raison d'etre for doing this kind of work. But what is true, I think, is that no one wants bad regulation, and that includes the regulators as well. So I see this as actually an important selling point, if you like, for getting involved in here, in this sort of issue. If we respond to these issues positively, if we take our responsibilities seriously today, then it helps to reduce that risk of bad regulation around the corner. Even if governments do clamp down, then it's likely it's going to set off in a better direction thanks to any ethical efforts that we can put in right now. Final piece on regulation, of course, different territories are going to have different approaches. They're all heading in slightly different routes. And as regulation tightens, it will be harder to be compliant across all these different regimes and countries. So we will see divergence. We will see perhaps this idea of the splinter net, the idea that we'll fracture the unity of this sort of monolithic global internet and create somewhat incompatible sub-internets, probably a US, a Chinese, and maybe a European, with the rest of the world plugging somewhere into that kind of system. But the final force is around employee pressure. And it's quite clear that in the last 2 years, maybe 2.5, employees have become much more capable at banding together to push for ethical change. Most famously, we've seen this at Google with Project Maven, defense DoD project, which could be used to target drone strikes or pilot drones at least. And then that was followed up by the Google walkout, which saw thousands of Google employees essentially on a wildcat strike over allegations of sexual harassment and cover-ups. And so this kind of activism has spread pretty much to all of the major tech firms and now is starting to trickle down to smaller firms as well. A lot of the companies that I engage with, even if they don't have anything formal like this, they often have grassroots appetites for this. They have small pockets of employees starting to mobilize around these issues. And that tells me something quite interesting, which is that tech workers, I think, are deeply motivated by values. And this is becoming now a sort of proven and effective way to mobilize some of that latent motivation, to create a better workplace and a better world. And it's not going to go away. Companies will have to recognize this shift and learn to accommodate it in some way. And it's clear to me now that ethics is also becoming a talent risk. Now, I'm always a little bit wary of, you get sweeping generalizations sometimes around millennials and Gen Z and so on. But it is true, I think, that newer entrants to the workplace are more values driven. And tech workers, of course, right now, this is a candidates market. Tech employees, literate tech people have the luxury of many options. And so they're becoming increasingly selective and quite tough on companies that have a sort of ethical toxicity. CNBC reported from people with knowledge of the industry, which is basically journalistic code for former employees, that Facebook was struggling to recruit. That back in 2016, about 90% of the offers made to software engineers were accepted, but then by 2019, only half of those candidates were accepting Facebook's offer. Now, in the interests of balance, Facebook does dispute those figures, but clearly something significant is shifting here. Prudential say that 1 in 4 workers right now is planning to look for a new job once the pandemic is fully over. We've had this year of working from home that's causing a reset. We're thinking, well, I'm done with it, right? This is my chance to opt out of bad management, of bad cultures, to opt out of the commute. Workers, I think, are starting to recognize their collective power within the tech industry, starting to realize that we're expensive, we're hard to hire, and you lift your fingers from the keyboard and nothing gets built. But this kind of activism, this mobilization, does make some companies quite nervous because it looks like good old-fashioned labor activism. It looks like striking, it looks like splitting risk across a large number of people, and so it feels like it might be sort of left-wing political labor activism. And it's true that sometimes some of these issues are quite left-leaning. You see here, for example, this is delivery workers striking for better paying conditions in London a couple of weeks ago. But actually, if you look at these movements, really it's not workers pushing for better paying conditions. They're pushing to change their company's ethical direction and the social impact that their work has. But nevertheless, it still raises companies' defense mechanisms, right? We'll come back to what that might mean. But we have now this growing sort of complexity actually in the tech ethics movement. And Carly Kind has written about this and said, really, you can map it to 3 waves, 3 phases. First, you had a philosophical wave where you had people saying, well, what we need is to listen to ethicists, for example, and moral philosophers. Then you had a second wave that was more technical, that was based on auditing, debiasing algorithms, a strong kind of AI and machine learning focus within that. And then a more recent wave, particularly in the US, after the killing of George Floyd and the BLM protests that have been going on a while now, that has been more focused around social justice issues. And that's probably still a predominant wave, I think, right now, what I'm seeing. But my contention here is all of these perspectives are valid, and actually none of them is sufficient. We need to attack this problem pretty much with all of these techniques. It's a yes and kind of scenario. And I'd maybe add that there's space for ecological ethics, for climate ethics, to really come into that mix as well. We are starting to see some movement here. Particularly, there's some climate pushback around cryptocurrencies and NFTs in the last few months. But the tech sector does have significant environmental impact. It's responsible for around 3% of greenhouse gases. And as we move to more streaming and more energy intensive networks like 5G, that will only grow. But this hasn't yet really been properly integrated, I would say, into the ethics movement. So we're going to see more alignment over the coming years, I think. Because for me, climate is the most important moral issue of the century. So there's no way it can really sit outside of our purview for long. So there is this growing activism and mobilization, but questions of impact are really starting to dog the field now. It's almost like we have a backlash against the techlash. And some teams, I think, have found themselves painted into quite narrow corners, realizing they've actually only been given a very limited part of the problem space to play with. MIT Tech Review recently, maybe a month or two ago, wrote an article about Facebook's responsible AI team. And essentially they were saying they've been dragged into very thin slices of technical debiasing and kept away from the meatier and frankly more important problems like hate speech or disinformation, or at least the more important problems for Facebook right now. And so there are these allegations that the field is really just ethics washing. They're doing things that look like ethics to score PR points, but they're not really making the change required. And so there are growing questions. Are these teams and initiatives, are they actually set up for success? Or are they hamstrung by the politics and by the higher ups who don't really care about making that change? And so some companies are actually going the other way. They're trying to withdraw from ethical and political discussion altogether. Coinbase did this last year, September, October. Brian Armstrong, their chief exec, said, well, we don't do politics or social impact anymore at this company. We only focus on our goal. And they paid off staff to leave. Basecamp did exactly the same about 2 weeks ago. And you may well have seen the frankly disastrous outcome of that. A third of their company has quit as a result of that imposition of this pretense of being an apolitical company. Because I think there's some important self-deception happening there, to be honest, that it's absurd for Coinbase, for example, to say that we don't do politics. Now, that entire crypto sector is sharply political. It's founded on libertarian ideals of free trade and decentralization and low or zero tax. Now, you can believe in that stance politically or not, but it's ridiculous to say that it's not a political position already. The choice not to engage with the ethical and political consequences of your work, that itself is an ethical and political choice. It's a vote for the status quo in our industry and in our world. And that might be okay. You might be fine with that, but that should be a conscious decision because your work will have those consequences whether you pay attention to them or not. So that suggests to me that it's better to handle them thoughtfully, to discuss them, to mitigate them, rather than do what Coinbase and Basecamp have done, which is to shrug their shoulders and say, hey, this isn't really my problem. And now, most worryingly of all, we've seen prominent ethics campaigners and internal critics have been resisted, retaliated against, and even fired. The National Labor Relations Board in the US found that Amazon had fired 2 employees illegally after they complained about Amazon's terrible climate record and then the risk of COVID in warehouses. Google have had some famous problems recently. They fired Timnit Gebru and Meg Mitchell, and their manager, who was essentially overruled on the firings as well, also left very recently. I believe Apple has just snapped them up. It's quite clear that this sort of ethical agitation doesn't always earn you friends. And so now I think we have this state of what we might call acrasia. This is an old philosophical and ethics term going back to Plato and Aristotle. Acrasia is really acting against our better moral judgment. Companies that know they're doing the wrong things, doing things that will harm the industry in the long run, but they're not actually making the changes. And we demonstrate this all the time. We make choices that aren't really in our interests. We have the greasy burger when we know we shouldn't. And, you can talk about what are the reasons for this. You can say, well, the incentives aren't there for this, or there's just a general inertia within companies to resist that kind of change. But a large part of it for me is actually that companies don't know how to translate what they consider wrongly, I think, to be an abstract and subjective thing like ethics. They don't know how to translate that into actionable change. They're not skilled in it. They've hired very STEM-ish kind of people who don't really have experience of this type of work, or they focused on just one of those ethical waves, the philosophical, the technical, or the justice angle, and on its own, that's probably not going to get them the results that they've been hoping for. So this is the work that I do today. I help companies to operationalize ethics, to say, okay, if you have some expectations and some commitments you've made, how do you actually get those embedded within particularly design and within product teams? And this is important work, I think, because this isn't just about internal politics. This is about who gets to shape the future of technology. What role should ethics have in big tech and beyond? It's sometimes easy to forget that our industry actually holds huge power. We have the potential to create futures, right? Which most sectors don't. It's right that we're in the spotlight. It's right that we're facing these big problems, but it's a challenge that this critical movement within it is also at a bit of a crossroads. So the question is, how can we respond to it? What practical advice can I offer? What am I seeing working on the ground? Well, the first thing I find myself saying again and again is we just have to push every button. We've got to pull every lever. We've got to try and tackle this issue at every available level: individual, collective, systemic. Now, the systemic stuff is probably a whole other talk. I'm not going to talk here about the ethics of capitalism or anything like that. But those are valid questions to be asked, and I'm glad there are people raising those things. But that's not really what I'm talking about today. What I'd like to do is talk about what I'm seeing working inside companies and maybe give some advice on how individuals or practitioners or companies can try to tackle these issues for themselves as well. And so I'm going to attempt to depict a responsible innovation process, if you like. And this is kind of a distillation of what I've been taking companies through over the last few years. And I'm going to try and step through this and explain what it means. The first step is what I'm calling decentering. This is really around refocusing, reconsidering the actors that are relevant to innovation. Now, I'm a designer, as I mentioned, by background and by faith almost. And over 2 decades of practice, I have been told repeatedly, I've been trained that I have to focus on the user. That if you focus on the user, you kind of solve everything else. And that's an understandable impulse, particularly when you contrast it with what came before, very sort of business-centric mindsets, or frankly, design wasn't even really a thing. It was something that some web developers happened to do while they were doing table layouts and web page design, right? And we've now seen a user-centered design field burgeoning around this idea of focusing on the user. And they have all these tools and scenarios and persona decks and user stories. And within that, there's a very common assumption, which is that any interaction between a user and a technology will be positive, will be a fulfilling experience. But in truth, a lot of the time, that's not the case. Technology is often imposed upon people without consent. You often have to use it, at times of high stress. You have negative interactions with that technology. And sometimes that's actually what the user wants. We might call this a persona non grata, an unwanted user of the system who wants to abuse it, to exploit it for their own personal benefit. Molly Claire Wilson from Simply Secure has created these useful categories which you can use essentially as kind of a red team perspective. How would a government misuse this technology? How could a stalker abuse other users through the things we built? So we have to broaden our understanding of what use actually means. We have to be skeptical of those utopian lies that we tell ourselves that everyone's going to use our product in positive and beneficial ways. But even if an interaction is positive, it may still damage other stakeholders. I can design a system that can help someone succeed in, booking a first-class flight or buying an SUV or buying a gun, but those things will be damaging to neighborhoods, to other people, to the environment, and so on. In other words, design and innovation is really not just about the individual. We've trained ourselves to focus on the user, but it's not about the user anymore. A critical feature of digital technology is scale. You can reach huge numbers of people at a very low cost. If you create a new social network, then that could reach hundreds of millions of active users within a few months. And so we have to realize that our impacts go beyond the individual. Technologies affect families, neighborhoods, and cities and nations. We have to find ways to account for those within our thinking. And so this means this idea of user centricity is really just deeply inadequate for the needs of the 21st century. And remember that diagram I showed you with the bar charts with the smiley faces, that idea that we think tech is generally quite good for me but bad for society. Well, that's a natural outcome of user-centered thinking. It promotes the idea of individual task success, but it ignores all these wider considerations. And perhaps the most powerful and damaging impacts of tech fall on non-users, people who haven't chosen to be part of that interaction at all. The example I like to give is Airbnb. If you live next door to an Airbnb rental, then your life gets worse. You no longer have a neighbor. You have a different set of neighbors every few days. They're not going to be interested in forming close social bonds. They're not going to spend their money in the local businesses. They'll spend it in the tourist traps. And of course, they will push their rents up around you in the local neighborhood as well. Or think about all the people affected and disemployed by automation, or the minorities who are disproportionately targeted by policing algorithms. And so we have to recognize that technology affects social relations, and power, and that its harms tend to fall on people who are already worse off in the world. And so this idea of this sort of monolithic user, that really doesn't work. One size does not fit all. Humanity is plural and diverse. We have to build and design systems for all and not just a few. And so we're now seeing what's been called the design justice movement, which sees design not as this idea of a single user success, but as a force that can help to address inequity and unfairness in the world around us. And design justice is all about trying to amplify underheard voices, bringing them actively to the center, to the heart of the innovation process. It's probably one of the most interesting and sometimes challenging areas of modern design and innovation. I think we'll see more of this line of thinking. But of course, then design doesn't just affect individuals and communities. It also affects social goods, social concepts. If you work at Facebook, for example, you've no doubt heard many people tell you that your work has threatened democracy. If you work at Instagram, then you'll have people telling you that the filters you have designed and released potentially have negative effects on self-image, particularly among the young. So these social goods as well are sometimes things that we ought to explicitly name in our innovation processes and try to design to defend those, to recognize that they're important actors we need to try to respect. And then finally, we have non-human actors. We have animals, we have the planet itself. Non-human life has been routinely exploited in the name of progress. Think of Laika the dog sent up to die in orbit, or the stray animals that Thomas Edison electrocuted to show the dangers of alternating current. These actors cannot speak for themselves. Their survival depends upon our stewardship, on us speaking up on their behalf. And so there's lots of discussion saying, should innovation be not user-centered, but human-centered, or even society-centered, or life-centered, planet-centered? And, some of those are interesting, but I'm actually not really interested in the prefix. I think the problem is that centering word. It's just too rigid. We have to find ways to understand and to balance all of the actors, all of the stakeholders in these systems, to weigh up their relevance for each use case, and to understand the potential impacts and choose approaches that actually address those interests. So for me, we need adaptability, we need fluidity. And the metaphor I like is a mixing desk. A sound engineer will listen to a mix of a song and adjust the peaks and troughs, a little nudge here, a little scoop here. And I think this is really what we need to be thinking of. If we have a project with high environmental risk, great, we dial up the interest that we pay there. High social impact, then let's pay more attention to what those might be and maybe reduce the volume or the primacy of business needs or user needs. So it's this kind of adaptive, fluid mindset, I think, is much more effective than this rigid centering. Then we need to think about what effects that kind of shift in focus and our decisions might have. We can anticipate, some of these decisions. This is why we design, right, to have an intended impact. But of course, there are all sorts of unintended uses, benefits, and harms that might result from our decisions. So we have to make some space to try to understand those, to anticipate them, to explore what could happen across this wider canvas of stakeholders. And when it comes to design, this is actually closing a natural loop. It's very standard as a designer that you'll look at the world around you and understand how it should influence your design approach. That's just what we call research. But we've been missing something, frankly, in our practice, which is closing that loop, that feedback loop of how will our product in turn affect the world? And that's the anticipation that I talk about. Who might be affected by this decision and how? It's kind of weird that this closure of the loop has been missing in our practice for so long. For me, it's time that we restored that natural symmetry and lived up to that responsibility. And there are many ways that you can try to tease out what might be the consequences of a decision. The simplest is probably something like Ethical Explorer. This is by Omidyar Network. Essentially, it's known categories of ethical risk, and it's got some prompt questions. It's like a little card deck that you can work through with your teammates or yourself. Things like surveillance, disinformation, exclusion. so that you can start to have sharper conversations about what might happen within those categories. But generally, there's a set of techniques that I think we should be leaning on more thoroughly here. The intersection between design and futures work is really interesting, and it's growing, particularly as an interesting space for ethics. Ethicists will often talk about what they call moral imagination, the idea that you have to think of potential future states and discuss who wins and who loses in those states, and then decide, well, how can we make those a bit fairer? And there are, a bunch of tools that you can employ here. Futures wheels, impact maps, hype cycles, the futures cone you see here. But the one I want to talk about here actually is one that designers have almost as a superpower. A lot of professions are able to talk about the future, to describe the future, but very few can actually make the future feel real in the way designers can. Designers can make things, prototype artifacts that can stimulate that moral imagination. They can help that future feel real. And so you take it out of the realm of abstract ethical thought experiments and you bring little strands of that future into today. And this is what we would call design fiction. What we see here is an example of a work of design fiction. It's called The Transparent Charging Station by The Incredible Machines, a small Dutch design studio. And it's a prototype, it's a design fiction of what a electric vehicle charging point might look like in, say, 10 years in a world of energy scarcity. And the way it works is you have an ID card that you authenticate with the system. You plug in your car at the bottom, and they prototype this thing. It's a great big 2-meter tall physical object. And then you use the controls above to request certain amounts of charge. And because there's not enough to go around, an algorithm will decide who gets priority. And then it essentially relays that decision, that algorithmic decision, through the kind of LED lights you see at the top here. But the designers, interestingly, they didn't stop there. They actually prototyped the ID cards as well. The idea being, as I say, you're given one that might perhaps align with your status in society. So maybe a doctor would have a card that gives them higher priority. Maybe they need priority for medical emergencies, with a caveat that if they abuse that power, then that would be punished. Underneath that, you'll see we have a probation ID. This might be something given to a recent offender. Maybe they're given lower priority or a cap on the charge in case they're seen as a flight risk. Now, the designers aren't saying this is the solution. They're not saying to their clients in Rotterdam and Utrecht, go and build these and install them in your cities. What they're doing is they're creating the design that asks good moral questions about, is this the future we want? There's enough ambiguity in this to really spark up those moral conversations. Because we see here that the convergence of connected objects, the IoT, public charging infrastructure, plus energy scarcity, that triangle, if they come together in this way, it could actually reinforce inequality, could make it more concrete and more stratified within society. So this is what I mean by using design fiction as a way to shortcut to moral debate. And even better, you can bring other people into that from this diverse audience. Rather than asking non-tech people, the general public, to try and imagine a certain technology in 10 years' time, design that, prototype it, give them that future today, bring them into the room and say, if it worked like this, is that a good or a bad thing? And so people can engage directly in the moral consequences of our decisions, which is a terrifically important point. Now, this means we have to create space, of course, to think about those impacts. It's very out of fashion, frankly, in tech companies, which empiricism is pretty much the dominant way of thinking, that you build, you measure, you learn, and that's the only valid way to build. And so I think desperately we need to change that idea, because it treats ethical damage as something that you fix afterwards. Well, you build something and you get feedback and you validate and you see what you've done wrong. You can't do that with something like, social harm or ethical damage. So we have to try to force this kind of change into companies. And usually we'll have to hijack some existing rituals for that. But what's important is at least starting that conversation. Once we've then anticipated what could happen, what might be the things that go well and go poorly, we have to prioritize, we have to evaluate and say which of these is actually an ethical problem and which can we safely ignore. To do that, I think we have to lose a bad habit. I think the tech industry loves to believe that it's the first set of brave explorers on any new shore. When I got into the field, I was amazed by the depth of work in tech ethics that I had no idea existed from inside the industry. The people in humanities, the osophists and geologists, and the artists and writers and critics, they've been looking at the social impact of tech for decades, but the industry has pretty much ignored them. So these people have been watching from the sideline as the industry just runs into the same walls again and again. So it's time we stop doing that. There is existing ethical theory here that we can lean on. It's not too hard to learn. These people can be brought in to help train companies and to elevate that level of discussion. And I think companies, when they do that, they're surprised to find that ethics is not subjective and flimsy, that it's far more robust than they might think. It gives structure to the debate that they previously didn't have. But there's something really important here. The critical question that I think we need to ask when we talk about these kinds of techniques is, well, who gets to decide what is ethical? And the unpleasant truth is it's usually the domain of the privileged, of elites, of philosophers, of leaders, of the educated. Silicon Valley loves to talk about technology's potential to democratize all sorts of domains. Now this is the chance to actually live up to that promise, to include others in this moral process. As I mentioned before, because technology is such a human thing, its harms tend to fall upon people who are already strongly disadvantaged in the world. So this technocracy really isn't the answer. It shouldn't be powerful people like us in our fancy offices and our Zoom calls. We should not be in sole control of the ethical direction of technology. We have to find a way to involve and engage others in that work. And so we need to be looking at new methods to engage, to radically include people in the way we design and build and innovate, bringing in things like co-design, participatory design, citizens' juries, even just expanding alpha and beta testing programs, and acting with transparency and honesty about the decisions and the trade-offs that we make. Essentially, this is about trying to design with people, not just for people. And this harkens to a powerful idea within particularly disability advocacy: nothing for us without us. And frankly, the tech industry is terrible at this. The tech industry, particularly in Silicon Valley, has excelled at designing exclusively, designing for their own interest and assuming that they will scale across the world. And we're finding that that isn't really the case. So this idea of radical inclusion of the public within design and innovation processes is terrifically important, I think. It's challenging for companies, absolutely, and companies are some are more successful at this kind of adaptation than others, but it's one that we really have to keep front and center as we introduce these new processes. Now, once we've evaluated the impacts, if you like, of our work, we then have an opportunity to actually do something differently. Of course, some of this is about mitigating harm, right? Designing out risk and saying there's a risk this can go wrong. Well, let's do whatever we can to avoid that damage before it happens. Let's debias our algorithms. Let's audit things and make sure that we're not, generating all sorts of irresponsible decisions. But also from a design and a product point of view, you can design in user safety protocols. It's really all about stopping bad ideas and bad things from happening. But there's more to it than that. I really believe in the power of positive opportunities as well. And this is really about reframing what we mean or how we talk about ethics. Far too many people see it as a negative thing, subjective, obstructive, something that's going to be a drag on innovation. And I see it quite differently. It is true that ethics is going to help you avoid painful mistakes. It's going to help you dodge risks. But I really see it as a positive force. Yes, it's a constraint, but constraints are also seeds of innovation. The analogy that I like to use is a trellis. Your commitment to ethics and to values, that creates a framework through and around which your products can grow. And you'll find then that they take on the shape of your values. Your thoughtfulness, your compassion, your honesty, they will reveal themselves through the details of your products. And that is a powerful advantage because it will help you stand out in wildly crowded marketplaces. It'll help you make better decisions, and it'll help you to build the trust that keeps customers loyal for life. So we have this kind of rough process, but it can't just be a one-off. You need also to build some infrastructure that makes this a habit, like an ethos of ethics rather than a one-off checklist. And so maybe you do need things like incentives that counterbalance or that eliminate that temptation to cut corners for the sake of hitting targets. Maybe you need to publish codes of ethics, core values, position statements, whatever kind of documentation you need. Maybe you need to benchmark, track your progress over time in measurable ways. And then maybe for high risk things, maybe you need oversight boards, appointments, committees, that kind of thing, for large changes and high risk things. So you can build this level of reinforcement and support that feeds into this process. But what matters here is I think that you do that as you need it. I think companies are quite averse to leading with this stuff. That's what looks bulky and difficult. And that's sort of almost what gives ethics this negative reputation is, well, everything's going to have to go through a committee. Like you might need a committee at some point, but let's see where things develop, as we build. And I've seen in practice that following a process like that is helpful. It helps companies grapple with these topics and translate them into something a bit more robust and operational. But of course, it is just a start. All of that needs to be paired with a change in mindset to become inquisitive and, sometimes critical as well. And that takes some guts. It's not always a popular thing, as I've mentioned. And you need internal safety to do that. A lot of the time that simply means seniority, to be honest, or financial comfort or stability. And I would never judge someone who doesn't feel able to push for ethical change in their organization. This can be a risky activity, and not everyone feels they have that safety, that space to do that. But I would like to close with this, that if you feel comfortable and safe in your future, your job, your career, your life, and if you're studying in data science, it's very likely that you will end up in that kind of quite luxurious position, right? This is a very in-demand field. If you end up in that position, then you're in the ideal place to use up just a bit of that social capital to speak up and to push for the change that we desperately need within this field. And I really hope you will, because frankly, we need all the help that we can get. So thank you very much for your time. That was great fun. And hopefully we have a bit of time for questions. A little bit of light reading, should you be particularly interested in the topic. But let's open it up for questions, perhaps.
That's great. Thank you so much. This was so fascinating, and I feel like I've written like tons of little notes and things like that. And if anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to do it in the Q&A area. But I'll ask at least like one or two questions.
Sure, yeah.
So I'm just sort of trying to pick like which one of the little word cloud things do I want to start with. I think one of the things that I've struggled a lot with is this point kind of convincing people that everything is political and that everything carries with it a moral weight. And especially after the Basecamp kind of fiasco, maybe because like that was the most recent thing, like getting people to understand that like the conversations that people were trying to have that were being forbidden at Basecamp they're political, but so is everything. And so is the decision to prevent people from having those conversations at work. And I mean, like I found myself really struggling and I think failing to convince people to see things as to see everything as sort of having like its own political weight to it. And I was wondering if you've encountered that kind of sort of pushback as well. If you feel like you've made any headway with stubborn people, what
Yeah,
you
that's the
would
hard
suggest?
bit. Sure. I mean, I think candidly, the political viewpoint that everything is political is quite a left-leaning viewpoint. Um, I try to sort of, I don't like depoliticizing ethics. I like to make the case that ethics should matter wherever you are on whatever political spectrum you choose to map. But I think it is probably fair to say that folks who are on the left tend to recognize or tend to believe in the power of systems, whereas folks who are on the right tend to believe in individual sovereignty and agency. And so that viewpoint that everything is political is quite a systems perspective. And people on the right tend to, bit of a generalization, but tend to believe that politics is more of a, capital P politics, right? It's who you vote for, and the rest is really just let me get on with my life. So I think that's one of the reasons there's that tension, because frankly, not everyone's politics recognizes that everything is political. Um, and it is a very tricky topic to navigate. But yeah, as I say, the biggest the biggest inroads I've been able to make are around what I was just saying, trying to you can't separate ethics from politics. You can't say we do not do politics because if ethics is the study of what should I do, you could kind of say politics is the study of what should we do, right? And it's very difficult to enact the ethical change you want in the world without engaging in politics. If I decide that, for example, capitalism is an unsustainable system, I can't just go and live outside of capitalism, right? It surrounds us, and I'm part of a capitalist country and society. But the best success I've had is just trying to tease those strands apart a little bit and say, look, yes, we need to engage in some tricky political conversation, and we will not always agree, but let's try to find a center, an ethical agreement, if you like. Sort of here's your unacceptable viewpoint, and here's your unacceptable viewpoint in each other's ground. But what's the core value that we do share? And the values are surprisingly flexible. And so you can say, well, we disagree on this, but we agree that we need to be transparent is a bad example because transparency is abused as a value a bunch. But let's say transparent. What does that mean? And so you translate it into something more concrete and ethical rather than contentious and political. I'm not an expert in that yet. I'm trying to get better, and that is a really difficult transition to make. But that's been moderately successful for me so far.
That's great. That is helpful. I think we have time for one more question, and it's from this person who's anonymous. Do you see self-regulation of algorithms? The idea is that you develop a process of analysis, document and review internally, but then you be prepared to share that with regulators, public, and activists. And so I would say, like, to what extent do you see regulation of algorithms? Because I guess I would my intuition is that, like, there is a degree of sort of internal documentation and everything like that, which is its own kind of regulation, but it's the regulation of, like, whether the code functions as the designer or whoever commissioned it expected, but not really, like, it's not thinking about it holistically the way that the questioner is asking, which is an interesting provocation.
Yeah. I can see that being part of a strategy, right? I think we're going to end up. I mean, I'd refer back to what the EU has suggested around AI, which is basically grading by risk, saying you're going to have high risk activities really high risk activities that will just be prohibited completely. You will not be able to use a machine learning system for manipulation, surveillance, whatever else it might be. Maybe facial recognition might end up in that category even. That's contentious, but we'll see. Beneath that, you'll have, maybe that's a very high risk, you'll have a high risk, and maybe that will require auditing and approval. Then you might have a medium risk where there isn't that kind of infrastructure required. You don't need to seek approval, but you need to have the documentation so that if you get audited, right? I'm
Hmm.
self-employed, so I have to do a tax return in the UK. They assume it's fine, but I might get picked out of the hat, and I have to validate and prove why I've taken advantage of whatever schemes I've done. So there might be a role for it as part of like a graded thing. Um, my brain's also going in interesting directions around like decentralized um, autonomous organizations, DAOs here. This sort of idea that essentially we could create or not necessarily self-auditing systems, but systems that other systems can audit. To say, essentially like here's an API into how I validated my algorithm is fair.
Hmm.
And if it meets the criteria that you have specified in your autonomous algorithm, then great, we can do business. We can take advantage of each other's systems. We can set up this API and exchange data or whatever it might be. And again, it's about specifying the rules and saying, here's how we've done it. Here are the standards by which we have uh, validated our systems. And if those meet your strict criteria, then great. Um, yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but that's my brain just bouncing off different walls there.
No, I think that's great. At least that satisfies my sort of curiosity in that space. I realize we're past time, so I'm going to go ahead and give everybody the rest of their days, the rest of wherever you are, time zones. I want to thank Kenneth again for coming and giving this talk. Kenneth, thank you so much. This has been super interesting, and I'm just so excited I'm always excited to get to chat with you and hear what you're thinking about. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.